Garcia, but we're hoping, since there's only 4 of you so far, that you all could unmute and introduce yourself as well. It's always great for us to know where people are from. Irene, I'm going to start with you because your top's on my screen.
Oh, good morning. This is so nice to have a small group. My name is Irene Chalmers. I'm an interpretive planner based in Toronto, and I have been following the work of International Coalition of Sites of Conscience for years and years, and I'm so thrilled that you're offering this workshop because prototyping is something that we talk a lot about, and I have not actually, to be just perfectly frank, done it on a lot of the tons of projects that I've worked on in a 30-year career. So there's just not always time for it. There's not always a budget for it. So I'm really thrilled for this and hope I can join the rest of the session. So thank you for offering it.
Emily, can you introduce yourself?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Good morning. My name is Emily Stovall, and I'm curator and manager of culture at a museum in a town just west of Ottawa, also in Ontario. So I'm really looking forward to this, something I'm really excited about.
Great. And Jennifer.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jennifer Barrett Parker, and I manage a team of project managers for Parks Canada. We work on large exhibit development projects across the system. And I had the pleasure of being trained on dialogue with Sarah Farron a few years ago. And we're trying to incorporate dialogic, compelling invitations into our exhibit developments. And I'm very interested in learning about prototyping for that. Thanks.
Great.
Oh, I'm based in Ontario.
Okay. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt you. Ava.
Hi all, I'm Ava. I am a student right now, a graduate student working on a Master's of Science and Architectural Studies with a focus on themed environments. And my background is in art history and anthropology as an undergrad. So I'm really interested in museum spaces and public spaces, exhibits, and those sorts of things. And I'm working on my master's research right now and focusing on kind of collaboration and co-creation in museum spaces, as well as kind of focusing on the social agency of people, places, and things within those contexts. So I only recently just found the Sites of Consciousness, and it looks like a really great coalition. And so I'm hoping to learn more and just kind of get more background and grounded within the communities that are relevant here. So thanks for having me.
And tell us where you are.
I'm in Orlando, Florida.
Ah, wow. Although you Canadians are killing it. So nice to have 3 of you here. So today, next slide. So the coalition seems new-ish to all of you. So a very quick thing about who we are. We are now more than 370 members in more than 65 countries around the world, which is amazing. It gives us a chance to learn from so many places. And in 2025, we will be celebrating our 25th anniversary. Next slide. So really what brings all the incredibly diverse collection of coalition members together are that they engage the public in dialogue on pressing social issues, that we talk about things that matter, that we invite the public to take action on issues raised at their site. And we take the broadest view of site that you can imagine, from a single historic place, which is probably how Parks Canada knows us, to whole countries, the Kigali Genocide Memorial in Rwanda, for instance, and online now in places where people cannot actually gather to be together. So our members also totally understand that we work collectively to preserve memory, promote truth, and pursue justice. So we really believe that memory and history in the past is a starting place, not an ending place for our work. So that's what we do. If any of you are interested in more about membership, you can find it on our website or reach out to Stacy and I. We love to talk about it with people. Next slide. So today, well, all right, we're going to skip this because there's so few of you and you already introduced yourself, and I Well, actually, but we'll ask the experimental question. Anybody want to share a time that they've experimented outside of work? And we're few enough that the chat or just unmuting yourself itself and speaking is fine, either one.
Can I was gonna just jump in and say that I work with fiber. And so all of that's experimentation. I build looms by hand. Some of them work, some of them don't. I haven't tried building a spinning wheel yet, but I fixed them. Sometimes they work better, sometimes they don't. And of course, color theory and the whole thing. And it's very freeing. And it's why we use so much experimentation in my museum, because I think that traditionally folks are not developing that as a skill for people. And so we do a lot of experimentation in our daily programming at the museum where I work.
Great. I'm mindful of keeping on time, so I'm going to move on, but just take one example. Apologies to the rest of you. Feel free to put it in the chat. In this 30 minutes, we'll define prototyping. We'll share some examples. We'll consider two kinds of questions that can be answered in prototyping. And as you have already figured out, you're going to participate with us. So next slide. And Stacy, that's you.
Thanks, Linda. So we're going to introduce prototyping in this section, and I'm very excited about this. It's one of my favorite things to do. Prototyping is just another way of saying experimenting or trying something new out. It's often thought of as something that is like just for designers, but it's actually such a useful tool for so many of us in so many parts of our lives, and in our professional lives. And the whole purpose of prototyping is to learn how to solve a particular challenge or question or problem that we're faced with. So that's why we prototype, is to figure out the answers to that question or the answers to those problems with the very people that it's intended for. So it helps us experiment before we do a larger project together or a larger exhibition together. And we love this example, letting visitors know that there's an experiment in process. And that is at the Rooms Museum. They have a great sign here that lets folks know we're prototyping. You can be a part of it, which is also really exciting. And you can prototype absolutely anything. You know, Emily was just talking about prototyping with fiber, right? You can prototype with cooking, or you can prototype with gardening, as Linda shared too. But you can absolutely prototype anything. You just take a part of whatever that project is and start to answer the questions that you don't know through that. So that may be that you want to try to tell a different story at your tours and understand, how do people respond to that story differently? What's the most effective way to tell that story? Or maybe it's a new sign or label in your exhibition and you're trying to elicit some more empathy from visitors. So what's the right wording that elicits that empathy? Or maybe it's adding dialogue into your programming, as someone just shared at the beginning. And it's about, okay, what's the kind of question that's really going to elicit the most interesting responses that allows people to learn from each other? So you're taking a piece of whatever that project is, experimenting with that, and learning from that. So absolutely anything can be prototyped. And I also want to mention that a lot of the examples I just shared are externally facing, but you also can experiment internally. How do you make your staff meetings more participatory? Or how do you design a structure for decision making that's really going to work for your team? You can experiment with those things as well. The most important part of prototyping from my perspective is that it is people-centered. It really prevents you from making changes in a vacuum. So when you're prototyping, you're learning how to create the most successful version of whatever you're doing with the very people that you're designing this for. So when you're prototyping, it really helps to get specific around, what community are you trying to serve with this project? Who is this for? And then trying this prototype out with those very people. It's also an incredibly empowering experience for visitors as well, They love to be a part of a prototype. They love to be part of an experiment and offer their feedback. So as you're doing this with visitors or volunteers or with partners or staff, you're really helping to also cultivate a stronger relationship and a stronger understanding of what they care about through that process as well. And Linda has a few examples here to share with you today.
Sure. On the left, it's I believe they're Girl Guides in Canada, right? Not Girl Scouts, is that right? Who are designing prototypes, because prototyping with people is always fabulous. Designing prototypes for a new exhibit, I think in Newfoundland about fishing. And so they are thinking together. So opening it up to have more people think is really great. Each little group designed their own ideas and shared them. On the right is the very first day of a prototype tour at the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center in Connecticut. And the idea was really building a dialogic tour where people could actually sit down and talk together by looking at 1850s resources, but then talking about, in kind of a quick dialogic framework, about what that means about race in the United States today. This is so prototypey that the table in the center is actually 2 cardboard boxes and a tablecloth. So next slide.
Such great examples, and kind of reiterates why we prototype in the first place, which is just to help us answer these unanswered questions we have about whatever it is we're working on, whether that's a project or an exhibition or a program or a process. It's all about us trying to learn and learn together, which is a wonderful part of prototyping, is it's that ongoing learning experience. And as we shared, you can build stronger relationships and understanding through the prototyping process as well. And the last thing we wanted to share around just an overview of prototyping and some tips around just prototyping generally is that it should be really messy. This is a scrappy, messy, imperfect process. So imperfection is actually ideal in your prototyping. If it is perfect, you wouldn't be prototyping it, right? You already have the answers to it, right? This is all about figuring out the answers and learning. So it should be cheap, messy, and imperfect as you're doing it. And as you're doing it, you may expect some failures and some mistakes along the way, and just know that's part of the learning process and part of why we prototype as well.
Okay, next slide. So there seemed to be, from all of Stacy and my prototyping experience, we came up with, which is, to be honest, kind of a lot in our time, 2 kinds of prototype questions. One, what do you want to learn? And that's what do you want to learn in the prototype? Do people understand how to do this? What's interesting to who? That little chart about interesting and confusing was done in that process by a kid who we used as a audience member. Is this the right place to do it? Should that conversation at Harriet Beecher Stowe be in the parlor? Should it be somewhere else? So part of it, that's like the learning about what do you want to learn about the process? Like what's interesting, how does it work? But then the second part of the prototype is how will it actually work? So framing the prototype for participants. What kind of instructions or guidance are needed? I spent one entire summer many, many years ago at a children's museum prototyping instructions about how to make a particular kind of paper hat. So long, the whole summer. I don't recommend that. And does it leave room for open-ended questions and dialogue? And I think that's a really critical part about, as we think about prototyping in exhibitions or prototyping with your staff, prototypes are not designed for yes and no answers. So these 2 kinds of questions are really critical. So next slide. We're going to put you to work a little bit, and we're a small enough group that we'll do all this together. So say you/we are developing an interactive, hands-on, no technology, that's a lot of qualifiers there, I realize, that explores climate justice. What would you like to learn? Can we flip back up to the previous question, Stace, or the previous slide? You know, what would you like to do? And like, do people understand what's interesting? So let's kind of focus on that. Okay, back to that slide. So we're going to do an exhibit about climate justice. I'm not even going to specify and say, given that most of you kind of come from this background, say it's at a historic site. We're not going to put it at a science museum. I think those conversations would be different. Say it's at a historic site. What would you like to know if you were designing a prototype? Anybody?
What was the like relationship that the people who were there before had with the climate, and how did they manage it?
Oh, interesting. Okay. Anybody else?
Do visitors understand what the climate justice, what's the context for an interactivity within that topic? What do they know already?
Right. I once heard someone give a talk at the Smithsonian that they had done a survey and discovered that absolutely a tiny percentage of people understood what the 18th century was. And so they just stopped using that term. Right. That's why you prototype. Anybody else? What else?
Is it important to them as a
Mm.
topic?
So are you starting to imagine what it could be? Are any of you who think in exhibition development ways or creative ways? I know you all are creative. A, because I've heard you all talk, and B, because I believe everyone can be creative. What might this thing be if you were developing a prototype?
It could be a map that demonstrates who is most impacted.
Oh, that's really interesting. I hadn't even ever thought of that. Anybody else have an idea about how you could explore climate justice?
It's funny, my mind also went to maps, Jennifer, but I was imagining maybe satellite images of the world over time. So how, rainforests have been cleared and how that impacts mainly the poorest people in the world, and, things like that. So overlaying maps, like a map overlay, whether it's, you said no technology, but it could still be, an overlay of images. I also thought of maps, something like that.
So interesting, right? All right, so let's go to the next slide. Now, how's it? So say we're going to work with maps of some sort. How's it going to work? What kind of instructions and materials? This is hands-on, so people are going to do something. How's it going to work?
Well, if there's no technology, then you can have like maps with acetates and overlays. So like a book, right? So maybe you'd want to try to figure out how big it needs to be, or how are there accessibility issues that need to be addressed? Are there, cognitive issues that need to be addressed? So how would it work?
What else? Any other ideas?
Images, those guys, Iconoclasts that do map work, they give you the symbology already, and then give you the opportunity to make your own so that you're populating it with a common
Interesting.
terminology, as it were.
So part of the activity is thinking about symbols for different things. Is that right? What else? Yeah, go ahead.
If it's meant to be dialogic, what is it like? I think when I jumped to maps, it was like, well, that's how you can deliver information. But then what's the interactive part that the visitor is engaging? And so I'd like the acetate part, or even maybe it's dry erase markers on a map that you can add something, because in dialogue, the visitors are bringing something to the conversation. Like, I have to admit, climate justice seems like a really big topic to try to get at, but in that way, they could mark on a map something they've witnessed in the climate or something like that.
That's great. And part of, you hit on an important point, is that prototyping is also sometimes finding out that your ideas are way too big, right? That's a great point. It's like, oh, we chose a giant thing for you guys to think about. But by asking people to think about climate change in their own context, you've, made it of a size that people could actually connect. And I think it's interesting as well, right? Experimenting with this. What does climate justice even mean to people? Right? And that's great. So if you think about it as dialogic, which I realize may be new to some of you, but dialogue to us is about the idea that you can draw on your own life experiences for personal and collective learning. So we all can talk about climate in some way. So what questions could we ask that would encourage more experimentation and learning from the other people whose things? Are there other kinds of questions we could ask?
Are we asking about the climate justice or about the activity? Are we getting at prototyping understanding of the activity, or
So
are we trying to
I think
understand?
what questions you might ask of visitors, and then I'm going to flip to what are you going to learn in the in the prototyping? Yeah. It's a two-parter.
It could be a question about something they've experienced. So like, what have you noticed? Or it could be something about what they desire in the future. What would you want there to be?
Ah, nice. And it could be, right, you could think about asking people to propose solutions. My favorite prototype I ever did in my whole life was a prototype about invention. Or innovation, I guess, was the topic of the exhibit. And we tested it with kids and had a whole bunch of supplies, pipe cleaners, things like that. And one kid held up kind of a pipe cleaner with then a U shape on top of it. Because the challenge was to design something that was useful at home. And I was like, what is that? And he's like, it's a 2-pronged toothbrush so you can brush your teeth faster. And that's amazing, right? That we learned so much in that prototyping day that then made it into the exhibit. So if we're going to prototype this, and I think it was, you had a point, it's like, it always seems expensive and that kind of stuff. If we were going to do this prototype about climate change using maps, what do you need to be able to do it? What supplies do you need?
I mean, you need supplies, the maps and everything, but to be honest, like the hardest thing that I find in incorporating this into a process, that you need people, you need participants. And how do you get them, and how do you make sure they're the same ones that are going to be experiencing the exhibit?
That's a great question. And I'll weigh in, and then maybe Stacy will weigh in as well. People are people in some way, and I've done it that sometimes you recruit people, like family audiences, to come for an evening, and you give them cookies and they'll prototype the toothbrush kid. Sometimes you do it on the floor in a space, but I've also prototyped in like totally random, like in front of a Walmart once. And I think you just have to be aggressive, not the right word, assertive about finding people to prototype. And to be honest, people love, as Stacey already mentioned, being behind the scenes, right? This is like, it's cool for people to think about being part of something before it's all the way finished. Stacey, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, you want a lot of people to prototype with, right? To figure out like how to get the answer right. So I always tended to prototype during big events that we were having, or during events where I know people are going to come already. And then there's a corner off to the side where we have some kind of experiment going on that may or may not be related to the event, right? But it's, you have a massive amount of folks who are coming, so you have that built-in audience. And then, as Linda said, like, it's particularly if you're trying to engage a specific community, going to one of the events that an organization from that community is hosting as well, and using that opportunity to also learn and experiment as a good way to approach it too.
Thanks.
Do you need an observer? Like, do you do the evaluation of the prototyping? Like, is it possible to be the facilitator and the evaluator, or do you need to have sort of third observing eyes on that?
Maybe you need two sets of observing eyes, I'd say. I've done it on my own where I'm the person who's like doing it and learning. It's a lot to learn. And I'll have to say, and Stacy, I think might be the same, this is not a hugely scientific process, right? The goal is to learn things from people. You don't need 100 people. Maybe you need 10 people. And then you realize that those same directions are crummy to 10 people. You don't need 90 more people to tell you those directions don't work, right? You can find that you actually can find out a lot of things from relatively small groups. I think it's really useful to have an observer or someone who can be either taking notes and observing, and we have our next webinar, we'll talk more about this, or interviewing people after they finish, all kinds of stuff. Emily.
You bring up a really good point that concerns me a little bit is when we're doing in sort of explicit prototyping and focus group work, we have not found a comfortable consent form. And for me, so sometimes I'll just bring an activity for young people into an environment, and we can just make sure that an activity does what we need it to do, I suppose. But if we're gathering a lot of sort of data, say we're in the exploratory phases of exhibit development, and we're bringing information in from that activity into that exhibit building process, I'm often concerned about free and informed consent. Have you found solutions to that?
I have never used a consent form. It's always clear to people through signage and through kind of personal interaction that it's an experiment and we're helping the museum. And, you know, it's not like you're identifying one person. You know, it's like this person, you know, Irene said this, right? It's never like that. It's like a, you know, it's like in an aggregate learning, not specific. Stacy, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on whether you're doing this on-site or off-site too. Like if it's on-site, folks should know that like, you know, you're gonna ask them to give feedback and contribute to the conversation as well. So I think, I guess from my perspective, less, you know, that's less required. But if you're going to another community organization or another group, asking them kind of what kind of consent process is gonna work for them. And they may say, nothing, or they may say, oh, actually, this is the way we kind of get consent, and asking them for ideas around that.
So basically we gave you an answer that usually we haven't worried about it. And thanks for raising something that we hadn't thought about yet. So we are right at the hour. So we've got a couple more slides just as a reminder about next steps in this process.
Yeah, and feel free to follow up with us around questions. We're going to actually dive a lot more into some of the questions that Emily brought up too in the next section. So the next webinar in this series is fast, cheap, and people-centered. So we're going to get into kind of developing those core questions into an actual experiment and kind of the ins and outs of actually prototyping and what that looks like. And then the final session that we're doing is observation and learning, and it's going to get into some of those questions of like, who's the observer and who's collecting the data and who's facilitating, and how do we actually take our learnings and put that into action. So that's the third webinar in this series. And we also wanted to share with you some related opportunities just to get you more involved with the coalition or to expand your learning. We're doing a series of open seat sessions. These two are in person or are online and remote over the course of 3 days. We're doing 2 hours each day. And this one is in person, the inclusive storytelling. The first one is about how to co-create with communities, how to collaborate with different kinds of communities, how to collaborate with visitors in that co-creation process, and that's in October. And then we have one around dialogue in difficult times, how to facilitate difficult conversations around dialogue, and that's in February. And our first in-person open seat training is this November at the Canadian Museum of Immigration at Pier 21 in Nova Scotia, Canada. And that's on inclusive storytelling for social change. So how do we tell more inclusive stories at our sites and in our work? And how do we collaborate with community members to tell those stories as well? We're so appreciative that you all have joined us for a very short prototyping session. If you all would like to give us feedback about this session, you can fill out this survey that helps us just improve the experiences that we are offering you. And we'll send an email today to you and everybody who's registered with the slides from today. A lot of the links that we mentioned, we'll share that in an email, and we hope you join us for our next prototyping session. And feel free to email Linda or I if you have further questions. Anything else, Linda?
No, that's it. Thanks for coming. It is nice to have a small group. We always want, audiences of thousands, but you can really have great conversations with small groups. So in some ways, that's the best. So thank you all.
Yeah.
Hope to see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
All right. Take
Bye-bye.
care.